Today, if you would like, you can go ahead and get your notes or your workbooks out or get your mind prepared as we leave behind the middle space of the biblical accounts. We're shifting off of the intertestamental period or the time of prophetic silence, and we're moving into the Gospels. That's going to give us a couple of new things to pay attention to in this transition. Today we're going to be beginning to lay out some of the details surrounding the life of Christ and some of the geographical touchstones and touch points for that. This lesson will probably creep into next Sunday. Next Sunday we'll also have a good in-depth look at the history and geography of the Gospel of Matthew and how Matthew incorporates a series of key biblical sites into the telling of the story of Christ. It's also a bit of a quiz, and so you can think of it that way as a knowledge test or a knowledge response. At this time, though, if you would, let's bow together in prayer as we begin our study today. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share in spiritual things. We thank you for the blessing of your word and of the shared community of Christians that we are part of. Help us as disciples to mature our faith. Help us to be attentive students who are willing to grow and mature. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in the name of your Son. Amen. So again, we are looking at the ongoing history and geography of the biblical accounts. Remember, we've talked about how we pay attention to different layers of information. We're trying to figure these things out. The top layer for us, theologically, biblically, approaching our spiritual core is always going to be, what parts of the story did God tell us? We expect that not every detail is there, especially when we get into the gospel context where we have multiple accounts giving us different sequences and goals, and so we pay attention to that level. Then we also think through how that impacted those communities later, and so some of our historical perspectives comes by reading through the epistles, reading through the book of Acts, and thinking through how these two sources interacted with each other. That is, what Jesus did while living and then what those disciples did afterwards. Then we pay attention to the larger historical record. Alan and Donna had a great question that came from last week's study that I'm going to repeat and rephrase. And so if I don't get this right, then it's not on me, not on them. How do we make a determination about how historical figures died? Like when there's not a biblical account per se about it, history says they died, and how do we then apply to that consideration of what maybe was their condition and what disease was taking place? Like some folks would say, well, why did this person die and we think they had cancer? How do we determine that when we don't believe or think that they would have had a way of diagnosing that specific kind of cancer when they were that age? And it's very simple. What's going on with historians is that they look at it and go, these are the symptoms that someone has when they have that disease. This is what it looks like. This is what their body does as it slowly goes into its expected demise. So it seems like that's the case. And then they exclude symptomatic issues of treatment, because treatment sometimes also causes symptoms as well. And they say, this is what we think. Now keep in mind, when that is the case, it means that we are making an educated, informed judgment as to what took place. Sometimes those educated judgments are changed by nuance of information. We learn a little bit more. Sometimes those educated judgments are also changed when we read the Bible. We go, hey, this seems like it would have been this way. And then we read the scriptures again and we catch a detail we didn't see before, and we have to adjust our understanding. This is the process of growth for all of us. And so that occurs a lot. That occurs particularly when we think about the culture of the biblical world. This is going to become incredibly important in the studies of the New Testament side of the biblical text. We've seen it a lot in the Old Testament, but we'll see it more precisely when we're thinking about how Jesus interacts with all the people around them. Because there's this conflict that occurs for all of us. It's a challenge. We look in the Bible, we read about it, and we say, this is my culture. I am a Christian now. I believe in these things. Then we have to sort out, what did God record in the Bible that was being done by those who were not Christians? Okay, it's in the Bible, but it may not be my culture. So I have to sort that out. Then I have to sort another layer out. What's in the Bible that's cultural, that's my people, spiritually speaking, where they are God's people, but they are not doing the right thing? Okay, yes, I'm still a biblicist. I'm still God's people. These are my culture, but I didn't do that either. That happens a lot in the Old Testament in regards to idolatry, where Israel has a very poor relationship up until the captivity with idolatrous practices. It creeps in to a certain degree at parts of the history of the community of Israel that becomes the kingdom of Israel. Idolatry actually is their default religion because they are so rebellious from their covenant. And so the question would be, did Israel have idols? Yes. Should they have had idols? No. New Testament is the same thing. A lot of the times we have to sort between, is Paul writing about culture in the view of how a Christian in that culture needs to behave, and then my culture is wildly different around me, and maybe that doesn't apply to me? Yes, sometimes it is. Sometimes he's giving advice that doesn't have the same impact to you and I, because our cultural world around us is vastly different. One of the biggest differences between first century culture and 21st century culture, and it's a blessing for us, and it was an awful context for them, is the volume of slaves. It's not something that we notice on the first level, but when you think about first century culture, everybody interacted with slaves every day. A lot of the writing then makes it very apparent that slavery was a normal experience in the first century. You see him talk about slaves, right? It's a regular conversational thing. The Bible even then regulates how slaves who are Christians are supposed to interact with Christians who are not slaves. Even if, and this is the most weird part of it for you and I, the slave was owned by a Christian. And I go, I know what I would do, right? If you owned a slave as a Christian, what do you think you would do? What's our cultural... There's only one answer to this question, folks. We are trained to know what the answer is, and the answer is we would free them, right? What are the consequences? Let's go back in our American history. In the first 10 years after the Civil War, to a freed slave south of Atlanta. If you were a Christian and you freed your slaves, you said, you can leave the plantation and go wherever you will. What would happen to that slave south of Atlanta 10 years after the Civil War?
Most of them wanted to stay where they were because they had no place to go.
Right, so the part of it is like, history tells us what they didn't know what to do. We would want to free them. Here's the consequence. We free them, they might die. So some Christians in that context who owned slaves sent them to the north, to other Christians they knew in the north. And they were taking place, by the way, before the Civil War. Many Christians were actually involved in the Underground Railroad and trying to help them out. Didn't make it better immediately because a freed slave in the South may not have been as safe as they were as a slave. And you saw some Christians carefully hiding the fact that they had emancipated the slaves that they had purchased, trying to work in the margins of the uncomfortable space. Now that makes all of us uncomfortable because our mind says we should free them. And we should, emotionally, legally, even spiritually. Keep in mind, 21st century America, 19th century America is vastly different than 1st century Rome. The capacity to free a slave is a different context. And what would happen to them afterwards could be incredibly different on the basis by which they became a slave under Roman law. So these are all careful things that you have to figure out. And sometimes you may not be able to do it. You might be the master of the slave, but the slave is owned by your master. because you too are a slave. And wait a minute, slaves are in charge of other slaves all the time. And you may not know any better. And so you find the Bible addressing things, social issues, from spiritual concepts that challenge us to reevaluate, okay, what's God's culture of God's people? What's the world's culture? And what do I do with that? Here's one more thing. The way in which Paul has to deal with head coverings, hair, and styles of the first century has to be sorted out from what does God want us to do and what those standards are. So this is something we're comfortable with certain subjects and certain issues. But understand that we're going to do that with all the things the minute we start talking about history. History helps us inform our minds about why Jesus may deal with the subject, why Paul may decide this is important. And then we figure out, now what about us? Now what about our context? What things are similar, what things are different? And a great context for that is to think about Paul's writings, both to the church at Corinth and the church at Rome. They are similar and then widely different. Corinth has nothing in common with some of the problems that they had with Rome, but Paul's approach is very similar. Big, broad principles, specific instruction, and then some reminders about how to navigate culture, how to navigate the community around them. Learning more about the community then will probably help us understand what Paul was up to. So, that's our future look. We're going to be going there. Let's get there by paying attention to a kind of a zoomed out look at the life of Christ. When we were closing out our study last week, we put a little bit of time in recognizing that God had begun to take the mute off of his people speaking about his work. And so we begin to see prophetic activity take place. We begin to see two types and then three kinds of messengers. First type of messenger, angels start showing up and doing stuff. Those are, again, the word angel itself, the meaning is messenger. And so it's similar to the idea of the apostle. These are ones who serve as emissaries. And so the angels show up, announce something big's going to happen. Then we have them relaying that message in the prophets. That's all the people who repeat what the angels said. They're working as prophets now. But then God also takes the universe into his hands and sends signs announcing the arrival of the Christ. That's where our wise people are able to say, hey, wait a minute, something's coming. That should make us make a pinpoint note. It's one of the illustrations of a question that comes up in life. Hey, did God work with nations other than Israel? And to encourage them towards God and towards heaven and towards godly things? And the answer is uniformly always yes. Everything up to the stories of Abraham, Sarah, Sarai, God's working with all humanity in a variety of ways. He continues to do so, but it's not the primary focus of the story, through Jonah, through the interaction with the other prophets and the nations right around Israel. And this is another key illustration of it, because he's got a nation, not Israel, being made aware that the Messiah is coming. So it's another example to answer that question of, yes, he did. Not the primary focus. We don't have a lot of details. But now that we know he did that. It also answers the question, 21st century, hey, what about today? What if he got this community somewhere where nobody knows of God? What's he doing? Whatever he needs to do. Because he's been doing that from creation till now. You just are not privileged to know the information. So we don't have specifics. We just know it's possible and predictable through history. So with Christ, it moves into the story of what is expected. These wise men expect to find Jesus in Jerusalem. It makes sense because it is the cultural center from the region. It had accepted in not only the historical past of being the place for Israel's spiritual center, but because of the conquest stories over the time that we've read about, going from Rome backwards, it is now a metropolitan community in its own right. But in the Jewish context, it is still the place where people are traveling from all over what we would consider the Mediterranean today to go back to the primary feast days. So you had in the first century, in the time of Herod, before the time of Herod, Jews that would have been living in Alexandria, living down in Egypt, living up in Rome, who are convicted spiritually, that they go back annually to observe the Passover. Now again, think about the kind of dedication it would take to go from Rome to Jerusalem to Rome. And it's not like you booked a flight and you went to, flights.google and you found the best time. You had to have a lot of money, a lot of commitment. You take risk in those endeavors. And so this is taking place where they are going from point A to point B, point A to point B, and back and forth. They would have traveled for the primary feast days for different reasons and different levels of commitment. Passover, Pentecost, Atonement, Purim. That is a remembrance from the rescue provided through Esther. Dedication, that's the remembrance of the interest of Judas Maccabee. Remember we talked about the beginnings of the Hasmonean dynasty and the Jewish kings who are of mixed heritage. This is kind of where it starts. It starts at this point and then branches all the way up to Herod, where we have both spiritually diverse and ethnically diverse ruling classes in Israel. The temple then becomes an even deeper center point for all of their customs. So if you think back historically, it's a good way to understand this. In a simple form, how would you describe the arrival of religious practice from the West into the Americas? How did that look like? What do we think about history telling us about how that happened? How did Christians get to the Americas? By boats. That's our simplest answers. Conquistadors are part of it. They did a corner on the other side, but by boat, right? They sailed over, and we attach it to Puritans because they had a large level of notoriety in the groups that came over, but they're not the only ones. In fact, it was religiously diverse in the money and leadership because it was culturally diverse. There's a large difference between the New Englands and the down islands below Florida. By the way, that's where Columbus landed. It's all down there. So Columbus land is everything below Florida. I'm pretty sure he actually never stepped foot in Florida whatsoever. It was all down in the islands. But our mind goes Columbus and across, and the conquistadors coming across the other edge. Each of them brought with them, wait for it, their unique religious practices, although they would all probably be classified as Christian historically. They had Catholic, they had what would become the Protestants, various forms of Orthodoxy. And you know what they did when they got to the Americas and the cities got big enough? They built colleges. Every major college, predominantly now we're talking about in the Northeast, began as a school of religious thought. All of them did. And many of them still have large schools of divinity. So now that's how you get all this diverse religious practice, even though it's in the same basket of claiming to be Christian, and they have their own institutions of learning and instruction. Guess what? If you go around Jerusalem in the times that lead up to Jesus, you know what you find? So there's a first ring around the temple space, which is all baptistries. It's all mikvahs. It's all places where they would ritually make sure people were physically clean and theologically clean in order to go up to the temple. The next ring out, well, it wasn't the schools. That's where all the money lenders and the exchange rates were. That's where you bought your sacrifices, often at a large level. And then the really egregious ones were up on the top level. One more layer, that's where all the schools were. That's where all the effective colleges were, where they would go and learn about the sects, the segments of Judaism. That's where Paul traveled from the place of his birth to go to the feet of Gamaliel, which was the #1 college in the land for a Jew. And so he was going to the best school to be the most connected to the heritage and closeness of Israel. And so That's the temple then is the center point for it. And your schools would have been on the outside layers. So all around that, you would have various little pop-up schools with reputations and connections to the various movements within the Jewish communities. So Paul's there at one of them. Gamaliel wasn't the only notable school, if you will, underneath him in that area, but he becomes the most dominant by the time of Paul. The most influential Pharisees would go through his, in essence, mentor space. Very common in that culture. And so that's going to help us then think about why they had such rigid edges between the various groups. Because if one person or one idea box is doing all the instruction, and the expectation is you're going to mimic what you were taught, then you get a little grouping. How do we know that? If I were to go out into the parking lot right now, how many UGA stickers might be present on a vehicle there? Is there more likely to find UGA paraphernalia in a car out there than it is to find, I'll make it real here, I know there's probably going to be an equal balance here of Oregon Beavers. There's at least 2 cars that probably have something Oregon related on the vehicle, right? Not just the beavers, because you probably have some ducks out there too. But they're not, they've traveled here to be here, right? So you got more UGA, less of that. That's what you have going on here. And when they get together, which team's better, Rich? What's the best football team in the land?
Beavers.
Right? I knew what the answer to that question is before I asked it. So, if I were to go to first century Jerusalem and I'm wandering around, and I'm a Jew from Mesopotamian area, and I'd come down there, and I'm wandering through the streets of Israel, and I happen to speak Hebrew, and I ask them, hey, where should I go to? Who's got the best school here? I want to learn more about my faith. Uniformly, they're going to go, Gamaliel. And actually, I'll speak in Greek at that point. Gamaliel, that's where you need to go. He's the guy. He's the man, because this is Jerusalem. This is where the Pharisees have a sense of power. Now, if he was politically minded, they might go, you know what? You need to go find some Sadducees. If he was wealthy, they definitely would have said, go to the Sanhedrin. Because that's where your people are. That's where you blend in. Take your highly expensive chariot and park it over there in valet parking, and we'll carry you over to the rest of the Sanhedrin, where the rest of your wealthy people are. That's what's going on. That's the kind of culture that's present, and it makes it understandable when we reframe it in a context that's similar to us. Here's the thing, though. Jerusalem should have been prepared for a Messiah. Theologically, in some ways, they all thought they were doing that. We're getting ready for it. We're preparing for the return of a king. We're doing it because we're establishing our power in the banking system. We're establishing our power in the educational system. We're establishing our power out in the fields and in the small cities. And each of those different groups believed that they were doing what was necessary to prepare for the Messiah. But all of them believed, if you read through their literature, that they were going to manage the new king. That they were going to help him decide what to do. They all thought they had an equal share in controlling the kingdom that was come, because the kingdom was going to liberate them from their oppressors and then elevate them to the position of the oppressor. That's how they worked it out in their heads. They didn't say oppressors, they said ruler. But that's all that actually happens when you switch from one oppressor to a new ruler. They eventually become the oppressor of a different group. The gathering of the scribes and the learned men then also became the place of the most severe persecution for Christ. The biggest problems for anyone involved in the Christ movement or the followers of the way centered in the same place where all this centralized conviction and practice and culture existed, because in part they really struggled to separate one from the other. And we see Jesus dealing with that, and we see Paul dealing with that. Hey, how come your disciples don't wash like they should? How come your disciples are... Who would bring this obviously Greek to the temple? That's what they believed was taking place. Who would do such a thing? Whoever. We will now riot because we believe you have done this. This is independent of the questions of whether or not these legitimately were issues. And even independent of the cases where it is purely just one person pressing their agenda. This is the struggle of a place that had that level of cultural structure and rigidity. And here's another term that's really important. Idea inbreeding. That is, someone holds an idea and then another person holds the same thing, and they never test it to see whether or not it's accurate. And so those ideas had just centered around and saying there's no difference between what the Pharisees tell us to do and what God says. They're actually just telling us how to do what God says. So therefore we need to follow it and do it exactly their way. We got to wash our hands this way. We got to make sure we dress this certain way. And so when Jesus comes in and says, short version, no, that's 100% wrong. You can sort out the difference between what man says and what God says. Stop following what man says and just do what God said. And everyone was upset. Because it's as if they had come to him and said, you know what? Sorry, Rich. The Beavers aren't the best football team, and neither are the Dogs. And he said that on Saturday morning right before all the games started. And said none of the football teams are the best. We would all go, it's just football, right? But that's the context of how it would feel. It would feel as if it was that close to your, this is important to me, I know what the right answers are. Jesus also did a lot of his teaching in the spaces that were really close to there. So, and we'll talk about that when we look at each of these texts. In the center piece, you have the rebuilt temple that is the kind of best version they've had as they've kind of repaired bits and pieces of it. And then you have the original line of where the old temple grounds would have been. A lot of the interactions that take place between Jesus and these other groups are outside of that. They're not technically in the space that God had defined a boundary around. Because when Herod the Great, remember anything is about a building, and it's relating to a Herod, that's our Herod that's involved, he made all that space much bigger. And so a lot of the riots that take place, a lot of the teaching that Jesus does, even when he goes and beats all of the money changers out, it's all in this wider space that is truly temple space now, but is not sanctioned as only Jewish entry, only those who are Jewish and priests. It's just the upper temple space around it, which is now currently, when you have the Temple Mount on maps, much of that area up there, that's all that space that Herod expanded outward. Really, if you're thinking about it and you go on Google Maps and look down at it, the area that's right around the Dome of the Rock, the central mosque that's right there, that's the temple space. And that's the space that you shouldn't have been in under the law. So, thinking about this now geographically, Jesus is born up in the area of Bethlehem. It is rural. It is underpopulated. It is by no means wealthy. This is an area where people engaged in subsistence farming and trades work. Remember when it says Jesus was a carpenter, it's not a woodworker, he's a builder. And he does everything involved in the trade of building in the first century, from basic masonry all the way through to woodworking, and any kind of important metalwork would have taken place in his same basket of tools family-wise. And so, as opposed to being a farmer, which would have been very common, and we say farmer would include the equivalent of herdsmen and gatherers from the various fields, he's involved in the support of that. That's what his family is doing. It's a skill. It's a learned skill that's translatable to all the communities in the area. So he's born into that world. He's born into that world in a way that now has him as some of the least economically advantaged. He is not abject poor because his family group has skill as a trade. He is never identified as being born into a family of slavery. So that means 2 layers of economic advantage over the 2 lowest groups. That doesn't mean he's wealthy, it just means he's less poor than those who are around him family-wise. Doesn't stay there long, obviously, but this is the area in which he was born in. It's not necessarily well populated beyond that. It's a fairly empty area. Later, Joseph would take the young child and his mother down to Egypt. Theologically, then, you could think about this is the beginning of what we can consider as another Exodus connection. And so this is a way in which the story of Jesus overlaps with the Exodus for Israel. There's a lot of similarity. Aside from paying through the attention of, hey, what's God doing with those phrases, one of the great things to do when you recognize these intertextual repeats is that this is a great memory tool. That is, if it happened once a certain way and then God's doing it another way, for me on a very basic level, that means I can remember it. So the Exodus has some key things, and Jesus repeats some of those key events, and we'll talk about that. Now I can remember it better. I can remember that Exodus. Oh, it's another Exodus. Okay. That means from Egypt up to here. Maybe there's some stories of liberation. Maybe he's running from something. Let me think about that and remember those details so it sticks inside my brain. It takes place to escape the anger of our great builder. Remember last week we talked about how interesting it was that Herod would have been so concerned about the birth of a little baby. But his rest of his life was absolutely concerned with anybody threatening his rule and his legacy. Because he not only would be willing to kill these families, he was willing to kill his own family as his mood shifted. In fact, in his instructions after his death, he laid a reminder to kill more people who threatened his reign. So it's not like, it's totally not out of character for this guy to hear a story about someone who might be a king from an area where he was ruling over and would supplant him as king, and he thought, clearly we've got to fix this. Not long after that, he himself would pass. Joseph would return to the Palestinian area when he heard that Herod had died. It's like, that particular issue, not a concern anymore. But he's afraid to stop in Judea because how cruel the current ruler is. It's still awful. So he took his family to Galilee, Nazareth, which was his original home. And so he went back to a place he knew. He had skills that he can use up there and decided to establish their place there. So now back in his home zone to a degree. It's not any more economically advantaged. In fact, it's probably poorer than where they were before. Remember, Nathaniel then in the storytelling side of things was skeptical that anything good could come out of Nazareth. It's about 80 miles north of Jerusalem. We really don't know from all the corners of history what Jesus was doing for a good chunk of time. Every time we do things like, and I've just done this morning, Joseph certainly would have taught Jesus how to be a carpenter because some people knew him as the carpenter. Remember, that's us using educated guesses based on some word plays in the text when there's no specific evidence where it actually says he was taught to be a carpenter by his father. It's assumed. That makes sense. Because here's the thing, it doesn't make sense. Does it make sense for a preteen boy to be sitting in the temple and to be able to ask and answer questions from some of the oldest and wisest assumed human beings in regards to theology and Bible. Doesn't make any sense for him to do that, does it? So clearly his ability and capacity is extraordinary at that early age in spiritual things. And we do not know what his upbringing was other than he's in this home, he's cared for, he's provided for, he has relationships. Now, is it fair to make the assumption? Absolutely fair. It's always smart, though, to realize what you're doing. To know, hey, that's what I'm doing. I'm assuming that that's the source of this instruction. I'm assuming that that's where this comes from. It also seems that his true history is a closely kept secret. Clearly, his family knows. Because remember, he and John are related. They're blood kin. Mom knows way more than everybody else, right? She knows that this is something God is doing. And even in his initial miracles, they have 100% parent-child level conversation in advance of the wedding at Cana. Like, that's absolutely how parent-child conversations all go. Hey, could you? No. But I'll do it anyway. That's like the softest version of that. Because she knows. She knows that he has the capacity. And really that dialogue is about timing and opportunity and not whether that she knows he has this ability. Ask yourself the question. This is the one that all of us ask. How would she have known he could handle it based on what we know? Is there any illustration or example of him engaging in miraculous behavior prior to that event in the biblical text? Like a record of Jesus performing a known miracle in Mary's presence. Depends on how they answer the question. Because the very fact that he exists is a pretty strong miracle. The very fact that she knows that this is God's doing, also pretty. She's talked to angels. How many of you have been terrified at a seraphim? I'm terrified when I read about them, so I've never seen one. I imagine I'd be triply terrified for one of those angelic messengers. So she's experienced things that we haven't. It also answers the dumb song that's stuck in your head every Christmas. Mary, did you know? She knew. It's answered everything. Whole song? Yes. She knew. So now that I've ruined the song for you, hopefully no one will play it on the radio anymore. Or you'll just smile when it does. That's my own personal wish. Or at least no choruses will sing it anymore. I'm also kind of worn out in that one. A little we're out there. The next event that takes place is the beginning of the preaching of John. Remember, John actually is supposed to be the forerunner. And he is. He serves in that role. His birth is equivalently miraculous in context. Because it shouldn't happen, right? It shouldn't happen to have this kind of level of knowledge. They even in the womb are identified as having an interconnected relationship. So there's a level of spirituality going on outside of Jesus that is saying, here's a big thing happening. And what is interesting beyond that is approximately around the time of John is when you see the run-up to the large volume of people claiming to be the Christ. It is not as if that didn't happen prior to the preaching of John in Jerusalem, but the amount, the sheer volume of people thinking, well, maybe I'm the one, maybe they're the one. That's why when you get to the point with Jesus in Jerusalem, they're saying, hey, didn't we just have one of these? Didn't we just have another one of these? And another one of these? It's a very large volume run-up. He preaches a message that's not going to be well loved by those inside of Jerusalem. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now, if you're a Pharisee or you're a Sadducee, you're okay with that message as long as it's preached to somebody else. Repent, you Sadducees, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Oh, that's a great message if you're a Pharisee. Repent, you Pharisees, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's great if you're a Sadducee. What does John and Jesus boldly classify those whole group of religious leaders? Here's a pretty stark term. Brood of vipers! If you love snakes, don't raise your hand. But if you don't like snakes, you can raise your hand right now. I guarantee you more people hate snakes than love snakes. Right? I'm snake ambivalent. As long as snakes are doing their job, that is awesome. They can do their job all day long. I don't really want a pet snake in the house, because pet snakes get out of their cage. I've had friends who've had that experience more than once. They're sneaky. They can do stuff. So historically, being called a snake has never actually been a good thing. It's usually a negative, like kind of a slur towards you. Brood of vipers, you're poisonous, you're going to kill us. You're going to hypnotize us with your message. And so Jesus and John both begin to deplatform, lower the value of the speech and power of some of the biggest power brokers in that area. And now they're all, instead of going to Jerusalem, they're going out to listen to John. Now imagine how it affects the financial community around the temple. People going from all over the place, and your livelihood is bringing in all of the sacrifices into that ring of businesses around the temple. Like, hey, where'd everyone go? Shouldn't there be people buying my sacrifices? Shouldn't all these pilgrims be coming here? Modern America, we'd have an advertising campaign and tell everybody, hey, look, return to the center. Come bring your money. Revitalize. First century world, who do we need to kill? Who do we need to silence? Who do we need to make sure doesn't have influence? And so, not as much as there is a power struggle there and a theological struggle going on, there is also a personal animosity that comes across in that too, because everyone's going out to hear John instead of coming to where all the places of learning were, all the places of power were, all the centralized practice of religion. We're not actually quite certain where John's preaching takes place on the map. Regionally, we've got a good idea of where it likely would have occurred, because there's a few different terms that are used to describe it. But most likely we're talking about the intersection between the Jordan and the Dead Sea. There's a transition from life to death in the land there. So just maybe a quarter mile up the Jordan River, stuff grows. But as the salt from the Dead Sea is more prevalent in that delta section, then stuff starts dying off as it gets to the edge of the Dead Sea. It's more pronounced now than it was then, that edge between life and death. But also, it's not a great place to live because there's nothing to subsist on. So what was his diet, by the way? How many of you are ready for that diet? You guys want to go on a strict locust and honey diet? Everyone's like, I could probably get a few of you to try a locust, I think. I'll give one a go. It's crunchy. Look, the best way to do that is to close your eyes and cover it in chocolate. You'll never know. It's the only solution to the problem. And guess what? You'll know. You won't die. At least I didn't die. But honey, we accept that as a good food, right? Got to put some context in there. This is not a bee farmer, with trained domestic bees, and he's just able to kind of just carefully pull them off the cords and slice them off. That wax layer comes off, and the beautiful honey's coming down. This is a far more rustic. Well, let's use that terminology. And these bees aren't happy to see you. They're not polite, domesticized creatures. And this is weird. And it's supposed to be weird. It's not a normal thing to do. And the way he dresses is weird. And everything about it is uncomfortable, especially to those who are accustomed with Pilate. Les, who's in charge of the class, says it's time to stop. I hope you have some really challenging questions for next week, because Rich is going to be teaching class, and so you can go ahead and get those prepared. Get them squared away. Rich is going to do a great job.